In the second week, we'll continue with the kinds of insects and mites that are found with food crops, fruits, vegetables, herbs. But this week, the emphasis will be on things that chew leaves, and in particular, things that chew leaves and produce indirect feeding injuries, although, as we shall see, some do both direct and indirect injuries. So, this week, let us review what are the primary fruit and vegetable insects that do chew on leaves. Also, try to consider how plant defoliation, the effects of chewing injuries, can affect yield. And further, look at the insects that feed on other parts of the plant and indirectly damage crop yield, those in particular that feed on the roots. So let's start with the worms, the caterpillars one might find on a cabbage family plant. We could be talking about kale or broccoli or cabbage. These have a suite of kind of caterpillars pretty much anywhere in the world. And in Colorado, the big three kinds of caterpillars one would find on these kinds of plants, as well as in much of North America, would be the imported cabbage worm, the cabbage looper, and the diamondback moth. These cabbage worms can cause both indirect injuries when they're feeding on parts of the plants that we're not marketing, but they also do sometimes get into the head and damage material that we might like to market. Obviously, collards or kale, if we're trying to market the leaves, they would be feeding right on the leaves. So let's start with the imported cabbage worm, a very familiar insect, I think, to most people. It is, in the adult form, a white butterfly, often the most common butterfly one will see. It's also sometimes known as the cabbage butterfly or cabbage white. It's a European species that's been here since very shortly after the Europeans moved into this continent, and is well adapted and found pretty much anywhere you go in North America. The adults will lay their eggs on cabbage family plants. In this case, we see an adult moth or adult butterfly laying its eggs on the florets of broccoli. So they'll lay their eggs, usually one or two at a time, on the leaves or flowers of these host plants, which are all cabbage family plants. In this case, though, we've got one that's been a little inhibited by this. This is a mesh screening that was placed over a planting of collards, and the butterfly could not get through. So here's a fairly simple way to exclude this kind of insect. If they do lay their eggs, the eggs will be in the form of a small elongate object that kind of looks like a little bullet. It'll be white or kind of a pale yellow. And in a week or so, then the eggs will hatch, and you'll have a small caterpillar that will then feed and grow, and it will molt. And then the next stage will feed and grow and then molt. And the next stage will feed and grow and molt and feed and grow and molt. And within about 3 weeks, you have larvae that are nearly full grown, and as they get larger, they feed more heavily, and with this species, that's when they start to go for the head. In the early stages, they're usually feeding on the outside leaves. Later stages might go right into the head of a Brussels sprout or a broccoli head or cabbage head. In that case, they start to produce more significant injuries. When they're done, the caterpillars will often wander a bit away from the plant and settle somewhere. And in this transition stage, they're called a prepupa. The molt occurs, and then they're a pupa. And the pupa of the imported cabbage worm, since it is a butterfly, is in the form of a chrysalid or a chrysalis, which is what butterflies produce. So the pupa of the cabbage worm, it's a type of chrysalis, and it's attached at one point at the tip of the abdomen, and a little girdle of silk supports it next to the leaf. The pupa may be found on a plant some distance away from where it was feeding. The caterpillars often wander a considerable distance to find a place to pupate away from where they had been feeding. And then the moth, or excuse me, the butterfly emerges from the chrysalid about a week or so later. Repeats the cycle. You'll see the males and females mating, and then the females will lay eggs, maybe several dozen during the day, but one at a time, usually on the underside of a leaf. Now, The next caterpillar that one could also find on these very same plants is the cabbage looper. And this is an insect that you could also find on many other plants. Despite its common name, this insect, unlike the imported cabbage worm, is by no means restricted to cabbage family plants. You can find this on a potato, on a pea, on cotton. It has a very wide host range. It is a member of a group of caterpillars we call loopers, and why it's called a looper is because it doesn't have the full complement of prolegs, those leg-like appendages that are on the abdomen of caterpillars. Normally there are 5 pair, and in the case of the cabbage looper and its relatives, there's only 3. And as a result, when they walk in a kind of looping manner. The adult of the cabbage looper is a moth, and moths, unlike butterflies, fly at night almost always. So it is rarely observed, although we might see it sometimes late in the day, nectar feeding. In the case in the lower right, there's one that's feeding on nectar from rabbit brush in late summer. But normally they're going to be flying at night. You're not going to see the adult stage. Eggs, again, are laid one at a time, maybe in small groups, but the eggs are quite different in their form. Where you see them from that of an imported cabbage worm, they'd be round, and the egg would hatch, and you have a young cabbage looper larva that would feed for a while, then molt to the next stage, feed for a while, then molt to the next stage, feed for a while, and molt to the next stage. But again, they only have 3 pairs of prolegs and will be walking in a looping manner. And in the picture on the lower right, a full-grown one, you can see it rearing back, and the prolegs are pretty well displayed in this picture. When they're done, they may pupate on the plant or some distance away, and typical of moths that pupate above ground, they will cover themselves with some sort of silken cocoon. And in the picture on the upper left, we see the pupa of a cabbage worm that has been exposed from a silken cocoon that was attached to a cabbage leaf. In the picture in the lower right, we see the outline of the pupa and the cocoon intact around it. In this case, it had happened to have pupated on a petri dish, so we can see right through into what it would look like. And then the adults will emerge, and we might have 2, 3, 4 generations a year. But again, we'll rarely see the adults because they're night-flying moths, and not a particularly conspicuous one at that. The last of the cabbage worms that people are often going to find in a planting of some kind of cabbage family plant around here is the diamondback moth, an insect that gets its name because the moth has a little pattern that will be a little more obvious in some of the later pictures, where it looks like there's a series of diamond patterns running down the back when the wings are folded together. It is the caterpillar, as with all these, that is the stage that feeds on our plants. The moth just lays eggs and sips nectar. So the diamondback moth, compared to the others, is quite small. It's one of the smaller moths, and they're also one of the very earliest ones that are out and about. You can see diamondback moths perhaps as the very first moth in the spring. And that's because they are specialists on mustard family plants, cabbage family plants, and many of these are often present very early in the season. We have a lot of wild mustards, blue mustard, flaxweed, things like that are winter annuals. So they germinate in the fall, they're present in the spring, and you will see the diamondback moths on them as soon as it's warm enough. They'll lay eggs in the form of a small mass, but again, it's very tiny, and the eggs would of an entire mass of a diamondback moth would be probably less conspicuous than a single egg of the other 2 we've just talked about. Diamondback moth larvae are small. They're fairly hairless. They have kind of a little fork at the hind pair of legs, kind of look forked. They're very active, and when disturbed, they'll often wriggle quite vigorously. They will chew on leaves when they're young. They may not be able to chew all the way through, so you'll get a small little window pane leaving one surface. But later they can chew all the way through the leaf. This is an insect that is the most important pest of cabbage family plants in much of the world. Here in Colorado, it's under a good amount of natural control. and we rarely see damaging outbreaks that severely damage crops. But it's part of the package of things one will find on these crops. When they're full grown, they'll pupate in a loose cocoon, kind of like a little net that they'll produce, and it's usually attached to the leaves of the plant on which they were feeding. Then out comes the moth. Again, multiple generations can be produced in a single year. Now, we have these three kinds of caterpillars, and all feed on the leaves, but are they equivalent in their damage? No, they're not. They range quite a bit in size, and that's related to how much they're going to feed in large part. And this has been actually quantified in these three insects in something that's known as the cabbage looper equivalent, where a scientist in Canada, James Harcourt, looked at how much these would eat during the course of their life and quantified this. So the amount that a cabbage looper would eat, a single cabbage looper, is 1.5 times that of a cabbage worm. So it feeds the most, and it can eat more than 30 diamondback moth caterpillars, which are much smaller. So clearly, you might see different caterpillars on a plant, but some are going to be much more capable of doing damage. And it's maybe fairly easy to distinguish these by just their general appearance. Cabbage worms tend to be a little fuzzy. There's that little forked hind legs in the diamondback moth, and the limited number of prolegs that you see in a cabbage looper. You might also do a little behavioral experiment on this cabbage worm complex to figure out which one you have. And that would be just by disturbing them. They'll often react differently. So were you to disturb, say, just touch it on the head, a cabbage looper, it'll rear back. Almost always, and that's something the other two would not do. And were you to disturb a diamondback moth larva, it would usually have a very vigorous response. It would wriggle and perhaps drop on the plant. And were you to try to disturb a cabbage worm, it'd just sit there. It wouldn't do much. So that might help you figure out what kind of caterpillar you have on your plants. Even if you can't see all the detail, they act a little bit differently. Now, these direct injuries would be certainly most serious. If you have one of these cabbage worm problems and they are damaging what you're trying to produce for yourself or market, then this becomes a problem. You can't have damage to the head of a broccoli or the Brussels sprouts or the leaves of a leafy brassica. But oftentimes they're not feeding on the parts we will market, particularly if we're talking about a heading kind of a vegetable like a broccoli or a cauliflower, or a root vegetable like a rutabaga that's also in this family. And in that case, the damage is often largely confined to the outer leaves, the wrapper leaves they're sometimes called, the leaves that will help produce the main head that we'll market, but are not what we are going to harvest. And if damage is confined to these parts of the plant that we are not marketing, you can find that these plants can tolerate quite a bit of injury, perhaps a surprising amount of injury. So for example, this is some data from a trial I did a long time ago, and many people have done similar things, where I was trying to be a cabbage worm on broccoli, and I would take off 1/4 of the leaves, or I'd take off half of the leaves at different times in development of the plants. 20 days after transplanting, 30 days after transplanting, 45 days after transplanting, and then look at the yield. And if you look at this, if I took 25% of the leaves off, which is a lot, more than most caterpillars will be doing, and I look at the yield, which is in the right-hand column, it's in grams, and compare that to the untreated check at the bottom, which was a plant that had perfect leaves, that had no damage, the yield was equal to, maybe even a little higher than the check, even though they lost 1/4 of the leaves. Take off 50% of the leaves 3 weeks after transplanting, yield equal to, maybe even higher than the check. When I would take off the leaves at 45 days after transplanting, in this case, this is about when the plant had just started to produce a head, it no longer is putting on new leaves, yeah, there's a hit to yield. And that's pretty consistent. Plants can tolerate injury very well when they're actively growing and putting on a lot of leaves. They can tolerate it a little less well when they have shifted their growth into production of reproductive forms, the head or the flowers. There are quite a few natural enemies you'll see also impacting these cabbage worms in yards, gardens. There's tachinid flies that are particularly important on cabbage loopers. There's parasitic wasps that will attack the cabbage worm, and you might see evidence of this by the little cocoons they leave behind. And the European paper wasp has turned into an extremely important predator in most yards and gardens in the region, and they will often do a very good job of cleaning up all of the species of caterpillars that we will see in cabbage family plants these days. But if necessary, there are insecticides that can easily control leaf-feeding cabbage worms, including Bacillus thuringiensis, the Kostaki strain. This is the oldest use of this biological product, the microbe Bacillus thuringiensis, with lots of strains, but the original strains developed were for caterpillar situations such as this. The new product derived from microbes known as spinosad is also excellent on cabbage worms, as are other more standard insecticides, permethrin, carbaryl, and many others. But always do check the label. Make sure that if you are using any kind of insecticide, that it is specifically labeled for what you are applying it to. So that's the label is the law. But let's hope you don't have much in the way of cabbage worm problems in the future.